Hello YouTube chess lovers, welcome to the Chess Catalyst, and in today's video I'll be talking about the isolated pawn. This topic sounds simple, but most times the isolated pawn is what decides a game. When you have an isolated pawn, it can decide if you win or you lose. So make sure you stick to the end of this video, because what I'll be telling you in this video will increase your knowledge on the isolated pawn. So what is an isolated pawn? An isolated pawn is the pawn on d4. Basically a pawn that can't be defended by another pawn but by pieces alone. And this is a position from the Alapin Sicilian, and at this point black is putting pressure on the pawn on d4, and that brings us to the first disadvantage of the isolated pawn. The isolated pawn is a weakness because since it can't be defended by pawns, you have to keep using your pieces to defend, and this can restrict the flexibility of your pieces, because when you get a good square to move your piece to, you may not be able to, because if you do that, you lose a pawn, and that is one of the disadvantages of an isolated pawn. And I'll just go directly to what you should do when you have an isolated pawn. When you have an isolated pawn, you should be waiting for, let's say, since this is the Alapin Sicilian, I'm just going to play other moves. They don't necessarily need to be good. Let's see, one plan you can go for, mind you, if you play something like this, this won't work. It obviously won't work, because we have this move and white takes the queen. So when you have the isolated pawn, what you should be trying to do should be to exchange it off. There are some instances whereby the isolated pawn is actually used a lot in attack, but most times I would just advise you as a beginner, when you get a chance, trade it off. And you do this by trying to push forward. It's kind of similar to the backward pawn. You try to push forward and exchange it off. So at this point, let's say after a move like this, and let's say black goes back, you should be maybe going for a move like this, so that at this point is a wrong move. It's a wrong move at this point. But the plan is you should be trying to push the pawn on d4, and this makes it easy also. When you are playing against the isolated pawn, you should try to blockade it. What I mean by blockading it, let's say for example, let's just play random moves. Let's say this knight is on d5. At this point, this pawn can never advance unless the knight is being captured, because there's no pawn to chase the knight away. So that is one more disadvantage of the isolated pawn. You see the isolated pawn a lot. It does not have to be a center pawn. It can also be a pawn on the flank or at the side of the board. But mostly they are focused on in the center, because the center of the board is where a lot of action takes place. So to summarize it, when you have an isolated pawn, try to exchange it. There are some rare occasions whereby an isolated pawn is actually powerful, especially when it is in the middle of the board. But the cases are, let's say, for advanced players and so on. But when you are a beginner, you are still learning, when you have an isolated pawn, try to trade it off. That is the advice I would give you. And I don't want to make this video too long, so if you want a more detailed explanation, plans for both sides, how to create an isolated pawn, how to force an isolated pawn from your opponent, and so much more, let me know.